Wow, thank you, choir. And Sam, you really belted it out there, man. Way to go. That's awesome. Well, I'm really privileged and excited to introduce our keynote speaker for our missions weekend. He grew up in Southwest Virginia, graduated high school when he was 16 years old, attended Emory Henry College, felt a call to ministry, and became a Holston Conference pastor. He served 11 different appointments. He has also bicycled around Great Britain and Europe. I did not know that. He was elected bishop in 1988 of the South Georgia Conference, where he served for 12 years. Upon his retirement, he served with the Foundation for Evangelism, which is in Lake Junaluska. And in addition to that, he wrote a book called The Fun of Being Looney. He helped revitalize a congregation in Telford, Tennessee, as well as serving in a couple different interim appointments. And one thing I really appreciate about our speaker today is he's a man who exemplifies vitality. I hope as I grow older that I would have the same type of vitality for the Lord, for people, for the church, and for mission. And so I know you're going to enjoy him speaking today. So please give a warm welcome to Bishop Richard Looney.
That's good. Thanks. Thank you very much. In case you're worried, I am not as old as my back. So forgive the stool. Thank you, Scott, for making it available. It sure is great to be here. You've got a magnificent facility, haven't you? So you are a mission field. Do we have the mic okay? I may have pulled one loose. Yeah. Is this better? Yeah. You have a wonderful mission field here for the community and for blessing and serving God. You don't know how good it is at my age to be invited to speak anywhere, but especially here. And I am thankful that you hung around. My first bishop was Bishop Short, and he told about preaching at Old Centenary Church in Chattanooga before it united with First Church, became First Centenary. It was on Macaulay Avenue, 16 steps up from the street. As he made his way across, he met an old lady, helped her across the street, helped her up the steps. I think there were 16 steps. When they got to the top, she said, "I wonder who's preaching today." In his modesty, he said, "I understand the bishop is." She said, "Would you help me back down, please?" So not only did you come here a bishop, but a retired one, so thank you for being here. Did you notice the phrase, God so loved the world? I thought God loved the church, especially the United Methodist Church. And I thought God loved my race and my party and my country. But we're faced with the fact that God loved the world. Jesus said something incredible. He said, "The bread that I give for the life of the world is by flesh." And his closing words to the disciples were these: "Go and make disciples of all nations." And John Wesley said, "The world is my parish." Remember, Wesley was a good Anglican, but he was too enthusiastic. And the early Methodists were called enthusiasts. and he was barred from churches. So he preached in Epworth from his father's tombstone. The world, not the church, is my parish. And I want to congratulate you because you've caught that vision, haven't you? I'm thrilled about what you do for missions and what you're going to do today. I'm still haunted by an expression I heard years ago. It said, as a fire exists by burning, the church exists for mission. If there's no burning, there's no fire. If there's no mission, there may be a social club, but there's no church. I grew up in a home that personified love for missionaries. We entertained missionaries repeatedly. I heard stories of heroic service that still thrill me to remember. By the way, I'm looking for my watch. That's the most important thing a preacher possesses. Because if you run over, the Spirit's already left. So I'll try. If I forget to look, Scott, you have permission to do this, okay? Wrap it up, okay? Before I try to speak this morning, would you join me in a little experiment? The 40th Psalm has become one of my favorites. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined toward me. Picture that. Inclined toward me. He heard my voice. He snatched me out of the pit. He placed me on a rock. He put a new song in my heart. And I'm excited to be here, not because I get to give a talk or preach a sermon, but because sometimes God uses a human instrument to speak his message. And wouldn't it be great if God spoke through an old preacher? Wouldn't it be tragic if you weren't inclined, if you weren't listening? So do me a favor, would you? Sit up straight. Some of you look very comfortable. Sit up straight. Incline toward me. And smile as if something good might happen. And you know, I preach better to people who are inclined and who listen. That's your part. Do it well, will you? Do it well. The mission. You know, that we live in an amazing world because often the mission comes to us. Early on, I went on a mission from Holston Conference to Liberia in West Africa. Two of us were sent up to Zwedru, a frontier town in the middle of nowhere. We flew in and landed on a dirt runway. We were taken to a store and asked to sit under a tree while they made arrangements, because so many people said they were coming and didn't come. They made arrangements after you arrived. The store was looked after by the chief. His story was amazing. He loved education. He learned all he could learn in Zwedru. He walked through the jungle for 300 miles to get to the capital city. After that, that period of study, he was still hungry, and he came to America. And he happened into a little Methodist church in Kansas. He was not a Christian. This was during the civil rights struggle. Some of our churches would have barred the door to a black man. This church welcomed him as one of God's children. And in their love and welcome, he became attracted to the faith and became a Christian. And now, as a Christian, he's the chief in Zwedru and welcomes us. What if that little church had stood off from this black man, like some of our churches did? You see, the way we accept people, the way we welcome people is a mission. And God forgive us if anybody ever comes to our worship service and leaves without a welcome, or leaves assuming that people wish they weren't there. I heard a mention of Estonia. I was privileged to be in Estonia to represent the Council of Bishops at the Central Conference, when the Russian Provisional Annual Conference was welcomed as a full annual conference. They were welcomed by the Estonians, who had been under the heel of the brutal Russian dictatorship. And the glow on their faces as they welcomed their Russian brothers and sisters was unbelievable. And I heard a story while I was in Estonia. The Russians often came to Estonia to use their pebble beaches. It was a resort area. One day, a young man who was a punker, you know what a punker is? Pink hair, purple hair, torn clothes, sandals, happened into a little Methodist church. He sat in the back. A little woman got up and came back, and he assumed she was telling him to leave. He was not welcome. But instead, she was inviting him to come and sit with her and share her hymnal so she could explain the service to him. He became attracted to that church, and every summer they came, he slipped in to worship with them. He became interested in the faith. He started smuggling Bibles back into Russia. In time, he was called on to lead the Bible study one day. And when I was in Estonia, he was serving the largest Methodist church in Russia. Suppose the punker had been invited to leave. The mission of God would have been thwarted, right? And there's so many ways to be in mission. I flunked retirement several times, and in retirement I served 3 churches. The first one was a small church outside Jonesboro, Tennessee, less than 200 members. And I went to fill in a couple of months, and I stayed 3.5 years. It was great to serve a small church again. And they taught me a lot. They had a men's group that met for breakfast once a month on Saturday, but they didn't meet to study. They met to eat, to work. And every month they built a ramp for some handicapped person in the area. They did it free. They lived off donations. And I wish you could feel what I felt as I stood and the leader of our group, a layman, offered a prayer after the handicapped person had taken his first trip down the ramp. That church provided between 80 and 100 bicycles every Christmas for the children in the schools who would not get a decent gift at Christmas. They weren't large, they were huge in their mission. The local churches can reach out. When I served in Johnson City, they had an organization that cared for the retirees in Johnson City, not just the Methodists. Every year, they gave a Methodist dozen apples. A Methodist dozen is 13, one to spare. Every shut-in, they provided a large print devotional material. They would mow the yard or clean the fence if it was needed, because one man used his retirement extra income to set up this ministry. You do ministries like that. There's something exhilarating about being a part of a church that reaches out, that burns with passion for the world. And I invite all of you to be a part of that. You know, the wonderful thing we forget is that we are members of a connectional church. We don't do things alone, we do things together. And sometimes it's messy, because you have to connect with people you don't particularly agree with. You know, Jesus prayed that his disciples would be one. And it's interesting that we divide because we follow Jesus when we ignore Jesus, who wanted us to be one. And we can do so much more together. When I was in Johnson City, that district decided to sponsor missionaries in the Czech Republic, the most secular country in Europe. And I was privileged to go with them one year and speak to the preachers. And that was a fascinating experience. I spoke 6 times, and I had a different interpreter each time. Some of them were good, and some of them were not so good. And so many people spoke English that I had to back off when I was speaking to let them work out what was just said. I would say something, and the translator would say, blah, 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 and they'd say, no, that's not what he said. And then they would work out what I had said. And it was great to let them work it out. But here in a secular society was a church. And you know, Holston sent a preacher to an English-speaking church. I mean, the district did. And this conference is known everywhere as a mission conference. When I came along, we had the work in India, Dr. Carol Long from Johnson City. We sent Bob Lundy to Malaysia. We sent Gunnar Talman to Malaysia. We sent John Lundy to the Philippines. These were my heroes. And I was thankful to be a part of their life and their ministry. We couldn't send missionaries as one church, could we? But we sent hundreds as a connection. You know, sometimes we get fed up because we're assigned apportionments. Nobody wants to be apportioned something. But we've come up with, I think, a pretty fair system. Local churches give 1/10 of their offerings, excluding mission items and so forth, to the conference, and the general church. And it's unbelievable what we do together. I sat in a group this morning, Wesley Foundation. You know that we've got ministries on 5 university campuses. Could you do that alone? It's a part of the connection. Beautiful part of the connection. How many of you have been to an annual conference session? I wish all of you could go. One of the highlights is when the big trucks move in and we load up all the supplies we've given and accumulated across the conference and ship them out to the coast to be loaded in container ships and sent to Africa to feed, to educate. And when those horns go, honk, honk, it's like a message from Gabriel, you know. This is what the church ought to be. My first mission trip from Holston was to Peru. Peruvians are very short, and I'm sort of tall, as you can notice. And they weren't used to looking up at people. And I got one of my favorite nicknames. They call me Le Grand Hombre. That sounds good, the big man, you know, the Le Grand Hombre. Well, my first time preaching through an interpreter, the young interpreter was a Japanese lady who had never interpreted before. So she was interpreting in a 3rd or 4th language, and it was a disaster. So I finally just stopped and started singing in English, and that communicated. Music is a universal language. And then I heard one of my favorite stories. This American was in Latin America. He was preaching through an interpreter. He'd speak 30 seconds. The guy'd interpret 2 minutes. Finally, he stopped and said, "Excuse me, brother." Said, "Are you telling them what I'm telling you?" He said, "No, sir. I'm improving on it greatly." And we all would like to have somebody who improved on it greatly, wouldn't we? I was privileged to go to Korea. Korea has the fastest growing Methodist church probably anywhere. I attended a service. The church had 70,000 members. Can you imagine? They had a sanctuary that would seat 5,000. They had 4 services every Sunday. They were televised to satellite areas. When we arrived, they put us in the foreigners section, and I was a little bit put off. But in the foreigners section, you got simultaneous English translation, and you got an English bulletin. But the Koreans grow through prayer. They build prayer rooms, not Sunday school rooms. We were invited to Prayer Mountain for a 5 o'clock prayer meeting. 3,000 people drove in. And I said, "Lord, help us know how to pray." In Malaysia, I was privileged to visit Malaysia for 3 weeks. Malaysia is a fascinating country. It's a Muslim country. The church is tolerated, but it's very difficult to get property. So they will buy a house, knock the end out of it, put up an awning and 100 chairs, or they will rent space in a mall and set up shop, or they will pay a couple to live in a high-rise apartment building and allow their house, their apartment, to become a house church. And they have 5 annual conferences, not geographic, but language. English, Chinese, 2, Tamil from India, and the Iban, the headhunters, who are now Christian. we visited an Ebon longhouse. They don't build out in the jungle. They use the longhouses as churches. The one we visited had 18 doors. That meant 18 families lived there. So you just gather on the porch, have a service, and move on to the next longhouse. We saw one that had 36 doors. Why would you need to build when you've got it built, you see? And the Ebons were using motorcycles to get through the jungle to serve off river. The church, and you know, we started at one point those places with our missionaries, and now they are sending missionaries. Well, I could go on and on. Let me close with something pretty personal. I love that special number, Ain't Got Time to Die. My mom and dad retired on a very small pension. He'd been a pastor. I don't think he ever made more than $3,600 a year. But they had a passion for mission. And over the 20 years after their retirement, they raised $1 million for missions. My dad is a gardener as well as a preacher. They canned. Mother made jams and jellies. Dad even buried dogs and raised catnip. And they inspired other people to give. And they set up a foundation. And before their death, they left a third of it to the Holston Conference Foundation. The stock market's done well over the years, and I've been able to add to the fund. And for the rest of our lives, their money will go to mission. And that fund is over $1 million now after they'd spent 2/3 of it already on projects. My mom lived to be 84. My dad lived to be just short of 91. They were having too much fun to die. They shouldn't have lived that long. But they found new meaning and new purpose. I visited after I'd been elected bishop. My dad was a character. He said, "Boy, you may be the bishop in South Georgia, but when you come home, you're my boy and you'll do as I say." And I said, "What must I do?" So I collected aluminum cans in the ditches around Embry with a black garbage bag. When I got back to South Georgia, I wrote a little article. I thought they'd enjoy that their bishop was out collecting beer cans in the ditches at Embry, Virginia. A little church of 40 members picked up on that story, and the next year raised $1,600 for the children's home on beer cans, Coke cans. We all can do something if we want to, can't we? You want to? You want to? Sure you do. Well, I'm thankful to be a part of the United Methodist Church. It's fascinating that we are probably the most global Protestant denomination in the world. I wish all of you could attend the World Methodist Conference every 5 years. More than 80 Wesleyan denominations come together from the world in their native garb And we celebrate Brother John Wesley, who claimed the world as his parish. We've been through some tough times, haven't we? There's light at the end of the tunnel. There's hope in our despair. So bless you. Thank you for what you do. For your sake, I'll stop, though I could yak on and on about how I've experienced God's church in the world. And I want you to be proud of your part in it. Thank you. And I'll pay a fine. I ran over a little bit, but I'll blame it on my watch.